Imagine a night, a black sky, a cold wind, a fire that barely holds its own in the wind. A few dozen people sit around, wrapped in cloaks, their faces illuminated only by the flickering flame. These are not kings, not the rich, not those we would call rulers of the world. This is a small tribe of nomads wandering the lands of Anatolia. They live simply. They eat what they can find. They sleep where they stop. But on this night, something changes. Because in their hearts an idea is born that will later turn them into one of the greatest forces in the history of mankind. This story is not just about empire. It's about how a small seed can grow into a tree that will cast a shadow over half the world. It's about business and power, about dreams and disappointments, about people who forged ahead even when the whole world was against them. And I want you to listen to it not as dry facts from a textbook, but as a conversation with a friend. Because in every chapter you will find something for yourself. And at the end, we will reveal 5 lessons that can change your life. The Ottoman Empire began so modestly that few would have noticed. No golden thrones, no palaces, no resounding victories. Just a few hundred warriors led by Osman, a young leader who believed that something greater could be made from a simple tribe. They had few resources. They lived among powerful neighbors who looked down on them. The Byzantines considered them petty bandits. The other Turkish tribes did not take them seriously. But Osman had something that neither gold nor status could buy. He had a dream. Imagine this scene. A young warrior, still without a crown, stands on a hill and looks at foreign lands. He is surrounded by comrades, tired after the campaign. And he says a simple phrase. We will build a state that these lands have never known, and it will stand for centuries. At the time, it sounded like a fantasy. But it is precisely such words that create the future. The first Ottoman community was like a small startup. They started small. They gathered warriors, participated in small campaigns, gradually strengthened their authority. Their life was tough. Blood and sweat mixed in these lands, where every day could be the last. But it is in such conditions that the strongest characters are born. The peasants in the surrounding villages at first looked at the Ottomans with suspicion. Some feared them, some hated them, some waited for them to disappear, like other tribes before them. But it turned out differently, because over time, people saw that this new power brought not only war, but also order. Where they camped, a market appeared, roads appeared. Where the Ottomans had power, rules began to apply. And the peasants, tired of the chaos, began to believe that this could be the beginning of something greater. And at the heart of the community itself, a belief grew. A belief that they were not just a tribe, but a future nation. Osman and his closest associates had no plan for the century ahead. They had only one thing, the desire to survive and expand their borders. But it was this simplicity that gave them strength. Because when you start from nothing, every step forward is a victory. Imagine, a tribe that has just begun to raise its head is suddenly left without its leader. Osman, the very man whose name will become a symbol of the entire empire, passes away. And there is an emptiness. There is silence in the tents. The warriors look at each other, and in their eyes the question, what now? Who will lead us further? The death of the founder was the first great blow. For the empire, which had not yet become an empire, rested on his authority. His word was law, his dream a guide. And when he was gone, a schism looked into their hearts. Imagine these scenes, brothers fighting for power, warriors quietly debating whether to stay in camp or join other tribes, elders doubting whether this community would even survive. These were not pretty pictures of grandeur, they were chaos. And it was at this very moment that the empire could have been killed in its infancy. But the crisis has a strange power. It weeds out the weak and makes stronger those who can withstand. Osman's son, Orhan, takes on the burden of power. He is still young, his experience is limited. But he has the main thing, stubbornness and the belief that his father's cause cannot disappear. And it is this belief that begins to hold people together again. However, the trials were just beginning. Because Byzantium was nearby, an ancient, rich empire with cities, fortresses, and an army. For the Ottomans, they looked like a giant that could not be defeated. And when the first clash occurred, reality turned out to be harsh. The small Ottoman army, lacking sufficient experience, suffered a crushing defeat. Hundreds of soldiers did not return home, and those who survived carried with them a bitter taste of shame. Imagine that night after the battle. Exhausted, bloodied, they sit by the fires. Some are silent, some sob, some curse fate. But in this silence, an oath rings out: we will rise, and we will come back stronger. It was the first real promise that the crisis would not be the end, but would become fuel. In those days, even ordinary people felt this tension. The peasants, who saw the troops passing by, taking away food and livestock, often cursed both. Because for them, war always meant pain and loss. But there were also those who secretly rejoiced, because they saw that a new force, although weak now, could become an alternative to the old order that had long since rotted. People began to whisper, maybe these soldiers will be able to give us a new life? The first defeat, the first splits. These were the moments when the Ottoman Empire could have disappeared from the map without leaving a trace. But instead, they became the very pain that hardens. Because Orhan and his warriors understood the main thing. It is not the strongest who survives, but the one who knows how to learn from his mistakes. And from that time on, they began to change their approach. Discipline instead of chaos. Strategy instead of blind courage. Gradually, a new army, a new idea, a new force is born. And the crisis that could have been the end turns into a starting point for takeoff. After the first crises, the Ottoman Empire realized that only those who could create a system would survive. Faith alone was not enough, discipline was needed. And then they took a step that changed their history forever. They created a special army that became a legend. This army began with children. It was called the word devshirme, blood tax. Ottoman officials came to Christian villages in the Balkans and Anatolia, gathered boys aged 8 to 12, and took them into the Sultan's service. For families it was a blow. Mothers cried. Fathers silently clenched their fists, but it was impossible to refuse. And often the boys left forever. What was done to them next? They were taken away from their native culture and family. They were given new names, taught Turkish and Arabic, and forced to convert to Islam. The children were raised harshly. They were beaten for disobedience, punished for any weakness, and taught strict discipline. They had to get up before dawn, learn military drills, physical training, and memorize laws and prayers. Imagine this. A little boy who yesterday was running barefoot in the village, today stands in line with dozens of others. He has difficulty holding a spear, his shoulders ache, his eyes are filled with tears. But you can't cry, they beat you for it. And step by step, the child was made into a soldier. Devshirme was a terrible system, but it worked. The boys were broken, then built new people out of them, without family ties, without a past, loyal only to the Sultan. And it was from them that the Janissaries, the elite army of the Ottomans, grew. They became a symbol of power. The uniform, the drums, the steps in unison, all this inspired fear. Because the Janissaries fought without pity. They knew no other life than military. And their loyalty to the Sultan made them especially dangerous to enemies. Yes, it was a cruel system. For families, it was pain and loss. For children, it was years of coercion, pain, and harsh training. But for the Ottoman Empire, it was a major investment in the future. It was thanks to the Janissaries that the Ottomans began to win major battles. They took cities one after another. Their authority grew. People in the Balkans and Anatolia felt that they were no longer a divided tribe. This was a new force that was building order. Wherever the Sultan's troops passed, laws were established, bazaars were opened, mosques and roads were built. For ordinary peasants, this was a paradox. On the one hand, there was fear. They could take away their child, forced them to pay taxes, and live by other people's rules. On the other, stability was emerging, fewer bandits, more trade, and the roads were guarded. People began to understand that this force would not disappear like others, and it was better to adapt to it. The Ottomans were no longer just a nomadic tribe. They were building an army, a system, a state. And their dream was beginning to become a reality. Imagine a moment when an empire that had grown from a small settlement had already stretched its arms from the Balkans to the Arabian deserts, but something inside began to crack. People felt grandeur, but also pressure. Palaces shone with gold, mosques towered over cities, but somewhere deep in the hearts of their subjects lived a weariness. The sultans understood. If they stopped, the empire would begin to fall. And then symbolic steps appeared. Reforms, new laws, training the army according to the European model. They tried to change the old thinking, which was based on force and fear. They held secret meetings in the palaces, where only the closest advisors were allowed. There they decided how to make the world see the Ottomans not only as conquerors, but also as reformers. But transformation is always painful. The children of the Janissaries, who had grown up under strict discipline, now saw their world changing. Those who had once been forcibly taken from their families were now becoming examples of a new type of service. They were allowed to learn mathematics, engineering, navigation. But the memory of how they had been beaten, how they had been forced to practice military drill for years, did not disappear anywhere. This shadow of the past reminded us that any transformation begins with a break of old habits, painful methods, unjust orders. The first printing houses begin to appear in the cities. The smell of ink and paper spreads through the narrow streets of Istanbul. This is a different sound, a different rhythm of the empire, not only the drums of the army, but also the rustle of new ideas. People begin to talk, argue, criticize. And this is exactly what becomes a true sign of transformation, when questions appear instead of obedience. Power still rests on grandeur and fear, but the world is changing faster than the sultans can make decisions. And in this tension, a new era is born, an era when the Ottoman Empire ceases to be just a machine for conquest and begins to fight for its own survival in a new reality. Imagine a moment when the world stands still in the face of greatness. The Ottoman Empire, once a small state, now rises to the top. It is no longer just a country. It is an empire that holds continents, trade routes, cultures, and religions in its hands. It is the heart of the world, beating louder than any other. Istanbul, the former Constantinople, becomes a center where everything flows. Spices from India, silk from China, gold from Africa, ideas from Europe. In the narrow streets you can hear the bustle of many languages, and in the bazaars you can smell cinnamon, coffee, freshly baked bread. It was a world where everything seemed possible. The empire connected east and west, becoming a bridge that everyone dreamed of crossing. The Ottoman army at this time was considered invincible. The Janissaries, the same children who had once been taken from their parents, were now the main force that brought glory to the empire. Their march, heavy and steady, frightened the enemies even before the battle began. The drums beat so that the heart of even the bravest would shrink. It was a machine created by discipline and rigidity. But there is another side to this. Every victory had a shadow. Behind every step forward stood the tears of those who had once been forced to serve. And this duality made the story even more dramatic. At this time, the Ottoman Empire was building majestic symbols of its power. The Suleymani Mosque rose into the sky, like a reminder, we are here forever. Architecture became the language of ambition. Every stone, every pattern seemed to say, this is the power, this is the might. This is the beauty that this state would leave behind. People who entered those vaults felt that they were inside something bigger than themselves. This was a moment when the empire was not only creating laws or armies, It was creating a sense of grandeur. Such a breakthrough could not go unnoticed. European powers looked at the Ottoman Empire with respect and fear. Some admired its wealth, some hated its power, but there were no indifferent ones. The Ottomans became not just a participant in history, they wrote it. Imagine the scene. The Sultan sits in the Topkapi Palace, maps of the world in front of him, advisors arguing about where to go next. The choice between new conquests or strengthening trade was a choice of direction for millions of people. And here you can see the true scale. Every decision of one person could change the fate of entire nations. But with triumph comes danger. The global breakthrough created the illusion that the empire was unshakable. And it is in this illusion that the germ of future problems begins to live. The Janissaries become too powerful and begin to dictate their terms. The bureaucracy grows, and corruption quietly eats away at the system. And while the streets of Istanbul shine with torchlight, a shadow is already being born in the depths. But still, it was at this moment that the empire shone brightest. It was a time when it truly was the global heart of the world, when even those who suffered under its power acknowledged its greatness. It was a moment when it seemed that the Ottomans could not just rule, they could change the very course of history. And it is here, at the peak, that the main question arises: how long can greatness be maintained? After all, the real challenge is not to rise, but to stay at the top. Imagine a sultan sitting in his palace, framed in marble and gold. Before him are maps of the world, reports from distant provinces, the whispers of advisors. He seems to be the master of everything, but at the same time a prisoner of his own greatness. His word can destroy cities or raise them from the ruins. But what to do when an empire that grew on conquests begins to drown in its own shadow? The sultans after Suleiman the Magnificent were no longer such strong leaders. Many of them grew up in the luxury of the harem, somewhere in the depths of the palace, where life resembled not a struggle, but a fairy tale. They were surrounded by servants, entertainment, music, and they rarely knew the real harshness of the world. The empire, which was held on by the strength of the spirit of the first rulers, gradually found itself in the hands of those who did not understand the price of struggle. And this became the cause of the crisis. Imagine the contrast. Once upon a time, the ruler himself went to the battlefield, took risks, set an example. The soldiers saw him and were inspired. Now the sultans sat in grand halls, and others fought the battles. Their orders still rang out loudly, but they lacked the power that comes only from personal experience of battle. The Janissaries, once the backbone of the empire, had become its main challenge. They were so powerful that they began to dictate terms even to the sultans themselves. They demanded money, privileges, power. They would stage mutinies if anything went wrong. The empire that had created this military machine was now itself caught in its clutches. It was like a monster that had grown to the point of devouring its master. And there were also external challenges. Europe was changing. New technologies, ships, weapons were appearing. The empire, which yesterday was considered invincible, was now lagging behind. The Ottomans had long believed that their greatness was eternal. But the world was already preparing new rules of the game, and the old methods, force, discipline, fear, were beginning to lose their effectiveness. Imagine how ordinary people felt. In the provinces far from Istanbul, they saw taxes rising, the army taking their children away, and the rulers feasting away in palaces. This created discontent, a quiet anger that gradually eroded the foundations of the empire. And it was this moment, when the people lost confidence, that became the point where the real crisis began. The rulers tried to reform the system. Some tried to train the army according to the European model, others opened schools, printing houses, introduced new laws. But it was like patching old clothes that were coming apart at the seams. The problems were deeper. The majestic mosques still shone, but storms were brewing behind their walls. And imagine this picture. The Sultan looks out the window of his Topkapi palace, sees the blue Bosphorus, ships carrying goods. Everything looks calm, even beautiful. But he knows, beyond this horizon the world is changing. The empire that held half the world in its hands now faces a choice, to change or to fall. This crisis was inevitable. It became a mirror that showed, true strength is not in territories and not in gold. True strength is in the ability to learn, to change, to be flexible. And this is exactly what the Ottoman Empire began to lack. You know what's most interesting? The empire fell, but its shadow and grandeur never disappeared. The Ottoman Empire officially ceased to exist in 1922, when modern Turkey emerged in its place. But if you walk through the narrow streets of Istanbul, inhale the smell of coffee, hear the bustle of the bazaar and the call of the muezzin from the minaret, you will feel it is still here. Its legacy lives on in every stone, in the mosques that tower over the city, in the old fortresses on the banks of the Bosphorus, in the Topkapi Palace, where decisions were once made that changed the world. Its legacy also lives on in the culture, in the music, the cuisine, the traditions, in the sense of hospitality that still distinguishes this land. But more importantly, the Ottoman Empire left behind lessons, and not just for Turkey, but for the world. It showed how a small tribe could rise to the level of a global power, how discipline, belief in one's own cause, and a vision for the future could build an empire that was feared and respected for centuries. But it also showed that even the greatest power can crumble from within, through corruption, stagnation, and fear of change. Today we see these parallels in our own lives. The Ottomans remind us, start small, but dream big. Work on the quality of what you do, because that's the only way to build something that will last forever. Be ready to change, because the world never stands still. Use crisis as fuel, because it gives new strength. And most importantly, lead, not follow. Because true leaders don't repeat other people's steps, they create their own. Imagine the final picture. Today's Istanbul is a city that stands on two continents, connecting Europe and Asia. In the evening, the sun gilds the domes of mosques, seagulls circle over the water, and the smell of hot tea wafts from the tea houses. Here, in every sound and color, the history of empires still lives. It no longer rules the world, but it taught the world that power is not only about conquest, but also about the ability to leave a legacy.